Welcome back to our course, and this is lecture 6.3. We're back onto our Van Til book, and as I've indicated in an announcement or two, made a mistake on the syllabus. We're in the syllabus it says chapters 6 through 8. We're actually looking at 5 through 8. So sorry to add the extra pages, but we have to look at chapter 5. It's endemic to Van Til's whole case. And it's a lot of material for me to cover in 12 or 13 minutes, so let me get right to it. Chapter 5 is about point of contact. And what Van Til is going to argue is that between the believer and the unbeliever, there is no point of contact. Now, that may sound confusing because earlier in the book, he makes the point that we have to begin with people where they are. So if you're talking to a Freudian, you begin with Freudianism, if you're talking to a Marxist, and so on. But even though he thinks that there might be a similar point of beginning, there's no point of contact. Those are two different things for Van Til. And by point of contact, what he means is that Christians, or the Reformed Christian, as he always says here, because he believes that Reformed Christianity is the consistent form. And I agree with him in general. We would quibble on certain points. And of course, this book was written in 1955, third edition in 1967. A lot of new material has come out between 67 and today by evangelical writers, where there is a kind of a crossover between evangelical and Reformed that he was not really familiar with in his time. That being said, what does he mean by the point of contact, and what does he mean by the fact that the Christian begins with the Christian worldview? Essentially, what he means is that we have a metaphysic, an epistemology, an ethics that are part of the Christian understanding, and that we have to start there. We can't start with some neutral position or some other position and then try to help people work their way up the ladder to where we are. So for a Christian metaphysic, what he's essentially saying there, and I know metaphysics is one of those cryptic forms of philosophy for many of us, but that there is a biblical understanding of who God is, a biblical understanding of the nature of humanity, a biblical understanding of creation and the natural order, and we can't just sort of bracket that off and say, no, we're going to start with something else over here, and then hopefully we'll get to that. Van Til says we have to start there. A biblical understanding of ethics. We have to start with those things as our presuppositions. That's where the presuppositional idea really comes in, and that's why it's important to get something down with this chapter. So again, take a couple more minutes to say some things about what he is trying to get across in this chapter, and then we'll move on because we have a lot of distance to cover in this chapter. He talks about Romanism, Roman Catholicism. I've pointed out before, his big bugaboos in this book are Roman Catholicism, Protestant liberalism, Arminian evangelicalism, and then, of course, the unbelieving world. But he makes the point here that, for instance, on page 72 at the top, he says, in the question of starting point, it is all important that we have a truly Christian doctrine of man, but Rome does not have that. Rome, because it takes its theology from Thomas. Thomas became the senior or the canonized interpretation of Catholic theology beginning in the early 19th century. And Thomas is heavily dependent upon Aristotle. And Roman Catholicism has a different view of Adam and Eve as originally created and what their perfection meant. You'll have to read his material on that to understand. And therefore a different understanding of what it takes to move a person from the unregenerate state into the regenerate state. It's interesting that in this chapter he also takes on a fellow Reformed theologian, Charles Hodge. He thinks that Hodge has capitulated too much to Aristotle and to Thomas. But for him, this notion of the starting or the common point between believers and non-believers does not exist. He has this point that he makes on page 77, which has been an oft-quoted quote from Van Til and other writers. Toward the bottom of the page, he says, "The sinner has cemented colored glasses to his eyes, which he cannot remove, and all is yellow to the jaundiced eye. There can be no intelligent reasoning unless those who reason together understand what they mean by their words." That really is sort of Van Til at his essence. All right, there's a lot more material in this chapter, but we have to move on, as they say. And so in chapter 6, he talks about methodology. And here's where he really introduces us to his presuppositional methodology in more detail. By the way, these chapters are a little easier than chapters 2, 3, and 4. At least they are for me, and hopefully for you as well, because he's dealing with places and discussions where he defines his terms along the way. On page 99, he says at the bottom, to argue by presupposition is to indicate what are the epistemological and metaphysical principles that underlie and control one's method. Gets back to what I said at the very beginning of this lecture. And again, his dialogue partners, or the people to whom he will critique, are Catholics and Arminians and liberal Protestants. There's another famous little paragraph on page 102 that if you are a Van Til sort of follower, or if you've read much in presuppositional apologetics at all, this becomes a famous passage for Van Til. 102, middle of the page, talks about the real dilemma that humans have in an unregenerate condition. An illustration may indicate more clearly what is meant. Suppose we think of a man made of water in an infinitely extended and bottomless ocean of water. Desiring to get out of the water, he makes a ladder of water. He sets the ladder upon the water and against the water, and then attempts to climb out of the water. So hopeless and senseless a picture must be drawn of the natural man's methodology, based as it is upon the assumption that time or chance is ultimate. So it's quite an arresting image to think about a man of water trying to climb out of water on a ladder made of water. You could do a lot with that, or you could just laugh it off and say Van Til's crazy at that point. What he wants to do all through this is to make sure that we understand that our presupposition is based upon Scripture. And as with Scripture as our foundational presupposition, we can't really go with those approaches which either begin with an assumption of natural theology that comes first, Roman Catholicism, or with an Arminian view that blends Scripture with what he would consider to be humanistic proposals about the human character or human freedom, and certainly not with the unbelieving world and sort of asking Christian people to assume their assumptions. He's very critical of what we've called in here the classical method. He deals with that on pages 114 and following, where we begin with the theistic arguments. And it's interesting that for Van Til, the theistic arguments are not necessarily wrong or even inappropriate to use. And if you go back to Frame's introduction to presuppositionalism in the chapter that we read early in the week, Frame is not afraid to use these arguments. Neither is Van Til. But Van Til will not use them as a way to construct a positive apologetic. He will only use them to tear down the worldview of those who sort of start with those. So he's going to tear down the Catholic worldview by saying, you start with the arguments for the existence of God. There's some validity to them, not complete, but there's some validity to them. But you can't really start there. And gets into a discussion also. There's not a lot of Bible in Van Til, in case you haven't noticed, but he occasionally will go to a narrative. And so one of the narratives he goes to is the temptation in the garden, Genesis chapter 3. And he talks about the temptation to Eve. And he says, when Satan tempted Eve of the forbidden fruit, he tried to persuade her that God's announcement of the consequences of such an act would not be true. That was tantamount to saying that no assertion in terms of a rational scheme could predict the course of movement of time-controlled reality. On the other hand, when Satan tempted Eve, he virtually asked her to become a rationalist. And I think that's right. I think Satan did tempt Eve to become a rationalist, one of these people that Van Til says you can't reason with until they're willing to accept the biblical worldview. Because he said, the serpent said to Eve, as God said, and of course she took the bait. And then what the serpent did was to try to get her to formulate a new theology based upon her own rationality and her own reason. Chapter 7, he gets into the whole issue of authority and reason. We're going to have to run quickly from this point on. The non-Christian view of authority is that autonomous human reasoning. And this, of course, is something that Van Til is dead set against. But he's also going to make some very salient critiques against both modern views, those of Karl Barth and Emil Brunner. And by the way, I think he doesn't quite understand Barth. I can't go into details about it here. He's referring to the early Barth's dogmatics that were written in 1927, and does not make use of the church dogmatics that Barth began to publish in 1936, I believe. So I think some of his criticisms of Barth might have benefited from reading later Barthian views. But then he's going to go toward the Roman Catholic interpretation. And, of course, in Roman Catholicism, you have this stream of authority that comes from the Catholic magisterium, that is the Catholic leadership, the papacy and the cardinals and the theologians and so on. But it's fueled by three tributaries. One is Scripture, one is church councils and the decisions made at church councils, and one is from the papal decrees when he speaks ex cathedra, from the cathedra, the throne in Rome. And so Van Til doesn't really give us that detail, but that's an important thing to know. And of course, he's going to reject that. And then finally, he deals with common grace and scholasticism. Common grace is a very important theme in theology, especially to Reformed and especially to Dutch Reformed, because all the Dutch Reformed guys wrote books on common grace. Kuyper and Bavinck and Van Til, all of these guys did that. And what he tries to point out here is common grace is in some sense the same deal as the point of contact, but the point is that we have an innate knowledge of God. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following are very important to Van Til's whole argument. Men knew God, but they did not regard him as God. And so keep that in mind as you read this chapter. And we'll see you next week with McDowell, and we'll finish off both McDowell and Van Til. Thanks.